My name's Jason Graves, and I'm a composer for video games, TV, and film. One of the most fun things about Dead Space, the first game, but the whole series really, was the aleatoric, chaotic nature of the music. When you play it in the game and you hear the music playing back, it has a very immediate effect on you. And it's obviously intentionally supposed to be scary. What no one really understands, though, or really realizes, that at the recording sessions when we had it, it was all live musicians playing. The most fun I've ever had at a session, because essentially what the musicians are doing is everything wrong. They're doing everything that they were taught is the absolute worst thing to do for their instrument. So I got to do a lot of experimentation and try things that I'd never really tried before, trying to get sounds out of natural instruments that sounded unnatural. And it was really an extension of the game itself. The antagonists are the necromorphs, which is this amalgam of a word meaning they've been changed from humans into something else, but they were basically human to begin with. Wanted to do the same thing with the orchestra. You've got an orchestra, and for all you know, they could start playing some Mozart or Beethoven up there, but they put their bows up, they pick up their instruments, and instead you get this doesn't even sound like an orchestra kind of thing, and it makes me want to run away really fast. So that was the whole concept, and it was a wonderful experience. Aleatoric, it's basically Latin for dice or chance music. So the idea would be, instead of saying, here violins, play these notes this fast, and it's a melody, and you're all going to play it together, and it's going to sound perfect and be in tune, and everyone's going to identify with it because they recognize something they can remember, and it's hummable. What most people consider the best part about music. You connect with it. So aleatoric is the exact opposite. It's every single thing that you're supposed to do done the wrong way. Maybe I give all the players 5 or 6 notes and I just say, play these in any order you want, as fast as you can, and as high as you possibly can do it. So the players are given freedom to interpret the music the way they want, and it works perfectly with the game. That's what I love about music for games in general, is I seem to be given a lot of opportunity to kind of come up with different angles for the music that might not have been considered conventional or traditional, and they love it. The more different and original it is, it helps to brand the game. And that really all started with Dead Space. Follow-up. I honestly didn't expect a tenth of the recognition that the first Dead Space got. For me, as interesting and fun and educational as it was, I think I dismissed it because it was so non-musical and visceral. I didn't think that people would enjoy listening to it. It scared them, and that was great. I didn't realize how much people love to be scared. So when the second one came around, EA really just said, yeah, give us some more of that. They gave me enough rope to hang myself, quite literally, except they wanted it to be bigger, and I'd kind of already done as big as I could go, and I figured the most logical way to make it sound even bigger than the first one was to actually work backwards and make it sound as small as I possibly could, so that the listener is almost leaning forward. And I did string quartet music, and it's maybe a little scary, but a little more melodic, a little more normal, a little more of a connection to the listener. So they're kind of leaning in and listening, and then the orchestra comes in and it knocks you back on your seat. And that dichotomy, the difference between the small, intimate, lonely, vulnerable string quartet and the huge, aggressive necromorph orchestra, was basically the entire premise of Dead Space 2. I was so obsessed in college, and for about 10 years after college, listening to film music and classical music, that once I started on kind of more legitimate games that needed musical authenticity. Before Dead Space, there was very obvious World War II game, something that sounds like Raiders of the Lost Ark, and so there's a box that you're expected to play in. And with Dead Space, they blew the box into 1,000 pieces. And I look back to classical music. Penderecki is a Polish composer. Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima, very famous piece. The Shining uses a lot of his music, and those techniques I essentially studied, boiled down, decomposed, that's not the best word, but figured out how they worked and then put them into my own score for interactive purposes for the game. And that was all I studied, were those kind of 1960s experimental classical composers for the first Dead Space. For the second Dead Space, after literally 9 months of theoretical study and analysis and everything else from the first one, I intentionally put a wall up and didn't listen, study, or think about anything other than the first score that I did. And I used the first score to work on the second score. And in a way, it was a wonderful psychological barrier almost that I built. And I've never really looked back. That was in 2007 when I did the first Dead Space. The game came out in 2008. And ever since then, it was almost like a emotional freeing of my creativity. And I don't really go back and reference things, especially when a client says, maybe we want something that sounds like, okay, that's great. That the name is all I need to know. Now let me go figure out my filter through those emotions that you're looking for. Implementation of music for games is why I got into games in the first place. And it's a double-edged sword because every game is completely different. Every game has a different engine for the music and a different set of people. I have yet to find anyone who says, well, we don't want to do that much implementation. Everyone's heart is always in the right place. It comes down to time and budget allocation of that time. So for Dead Space, the beauty of it was you're talking about scary music. And we had 4 pieces of music essentially that were all playing at the same time. They would just get turned up and down depending on how scary the game needed to be at that one point in time. The really neat thing was you literally could have taken anything and thrown it together that I wrote and, oh wait, that's not the same rhythm. Wait a minute, that's not the... And it would work even better because it's supposed to be scary and tense. It's when you start having the more tonal, emotional, positive connection to the music that interactive can get really, really tricky. Tomb Raider is a great example. There was a lot of interactivity in that score, and I think 6 hours of music, something like that, that ended up getting put into the game. And it was one guy, Alex Wilmer, and myself. So Alex was putting in all the music on his own. And so now we're limited to how much time Alex has to put into the game. But as a result, it was he and I working together, a very tight 2-man team. And we just kept churning out different ways of having the music interact with the game. I prefer reactive music as opposed to predictive music. I mean, some games still do it, but I think we're kind of past the point now of you walk into the room and when you cross the threshold, the combat music starts and you're looking around for the guys because you know they're coming because the music has told you. Dead Space was the first title I worked on that was reactive, and you would get hit and the attack would start and then the music would either happen simultaneously if they could time it out correctly, or even almost as scoring the player's reaction, which is more of a film music kind of thing. It's a narrative and it's not force feeding you the story. It's reacting the way you're reacting as the player. A lot of times the developer has a fairly specific idea what the function of the music should be. And I've always been very sensitive to the emotional ties that the player has with the game and how to build on that bond with the music. And it seems almost innate now, but a lot of times melody or thematic material is a natural choice. Other times, the lack of melody or thematic material is a natural choice. And it's usually dictated by the gameplay. And even when there is something that maybe is a heavily recognized melody, I'll hold off on that for the in-game music. And I try to avoid loops as much as I can as well. That's another interactive thing, but there's nothing worse to me than again and again and again if the gameplay gets drawn out, which is exacerbated by the fact that you have a big melody that keeps playing over and over and over. So a lot of times I try to save the melodies and use them for menu screens, use them for cinematics, use them for intros and outros of chapters. And if they are in the game, it's more of a little reference here and there. So a perfect example of extreme differences would be Evolve, which is a Turtle Rock Studios production, and The Order 1886, which is Ready at Dawn. Evolve was completely non-melodic and non-thematic. There were really no themes. There was nothing to catch your ear for you to take away and hum, but that was done on purpose. The whole score is essentially a groove and a feeling and an energy and kind of a drive. That was the melodic sensibility of the score, but that's because you have five people, four on one team, one on another, talking and acting and responding to each other, and all these sound effects and everything going on in the game, and there was no room for melody. It would just be white noise. So the way to get the players to connect emotionally with the game there is just to give them the underpinning and the groove, and especially if you're the monster, you feel like there's this cool monstery kind of blood rushing and muscles and big bones and everything, and if you're the soldiers, you get this neat kind of techie sounding. It motivates you and moves you forward, but it's in the background. Now, The Order, on the other hand, is a very single person, story driven narrative that is very cinematic in its presentation. And it just begged for melodies and themes, especially in all those places that I like to put them, the intros and the outros and the cinematics and the menus and things like that. So it's great to be able to work on both of them because it's a yin and a yang as a composer. On one, I can focus on groove. I'm a drummer and a percussionist and a guitarist, so I get to bang things and strum and have that fun kind of band mentality. And then I can turn around on the second half of the day and think about melody and harmony and counterpoint and orchestration. And they balance each other out personally for me. And then they work in the game. Hopefully they're stronger because I'm able to kind of classify and separate what each game needs specifically. Sound design many times is running parallel to music, and not even the same chapters. We're working simultaneously, but on different things. So a lot of it just comes down to the mix. And with all the stuff I talked about, the pre-baked ideas, cinematics, intros, and outros, sometimes we can coordinate on that. Most of the time, it's throw it on the dubbing stage and figure out how to get it to work. But as a composer, I understand if we're in a combat sequence, I need to do short kinds of things that are going to pop up and kind of get in and out of the way and not get in the way of all the gunfire and the communication of the players. So usually it falls on me to predetermine the path of least resistance for the music. And it's exploration and menus and things where I can kind of stretch out a little bit and fill up a little more of the space. There were so many wonderful opportunities in Tomb Raider that I feel like Crystal Dynamics entrusted me with almost absolutely. And the biggest one was the theme. They wanted a new theme, and that's no small responsibility, having played the first and second games and really grown up with it. And honestly, I was prepared for a lot of back and forth. That's just the way music happens a lot of times. And I've always been a big fan of ideas that you listen to them and you can remember them. They're simple and hummable, but also unique. But if you hear the reasoning behind it, well, there's a leap here because of this, and then there's a further connection to it. So when presented something like a new theme for Tomb Raider, I love the idea of something slowly moving upwards, but then I had a leap. So there's a small step, and then there's a big leap that resolves. And the idea, I almost saw her climbing or jumping the way she does, and all the traversal stuff. And in the beginning, I always start on piano because it's the most straightforward. Everyone knows what a piano sounds like. So everyone can identify with it, and it's a very simple way for me to figure out the chords. And I thought it would be great if we could start out small like this, because this is an origin story, and she starts out naive and unexperienced and scared and grows from there. And very much like Dead Space 2, to get bigger, I felt like I needed to go smaller. I wanted that same kind of trajectory in Tomb Raider. I honestly didn't think that they would go for it because piano, simple, quiet, introverted, and they had nothing but great things to say about the very first demo that I sent. And it was really, really reassuring because it was in the beginning of the process. And I knew if we could start with that and a solo cello, just two voices, that by the time we got to the end, it would have a emotional impact and weight to it. And there would be a line, musically speaking, that followed her journey. And we were able to arc the music in terms of the instruments and everything. As she progressed and got more confident, more instruments are added, bigger drums are added. And there was really only one kind of over the top game music cinematic kind of combat thing, and it was the very last sequence in the game. And I was able to do that without any resistance from the developer at all. They just kept saying, this is great, this is great, this is great. And I would have expected, we need more, the combat needs to be bigger, we need to be, and they were right in line with what I thought. So when that happens, it's really, really great. What an amazing project. What an amazing opportunity. It was another example where the developer came to me and said, here's our game. Here are the emotions that we want the player to feel when they're playing our game. Go do your thing. And a lot of times that's wonderful, but there are limitations in terms of schedule. There are limitations maybe in terms of production because it's me in the studio. So there's always some blinders you have to put on and be realistic. With this game, it was really open-ended. So everything that I ended up doing was my original pitch for the Moon idea of, well, if we went to Abbey Road and if we had these crazy instruments and everything, they just said, sure, let's try it and see what happens. So with that being said, the premise of the game is it's in London, it's in 1886. We wanted to reference the time period slightly. We didn't want to postmodern synth 1886. We wanted it to be acoustic, but we also wanted it to be different. And I think the biggest challenge with a game or a film or anything is to have a unique sound that's identifiable almost instantaneously. For me, I almost consider it cheating, but the easiest way to do that is just to start taking away instruments. Just take them away, take them away, take them away. And since this was going to be an orchestral score, essentially, the developers wanted weight, a sense of weight on the players, on the other characters in the game. So my natural thoughts were, I'll favor the weighty instruments. I'll favor the low, heavy instruments in the orchestra. And I thought, well, why do I even need anything that's not a low, heavy instrument? And what can I eliminate that is a very expected, almost cliche version of itself in a lot of film and games today? Because this is a big game and they wanted big production, but they wanted something original. So the first thing I did was I eliminated all the violins. No violins at all. Double up on the violas, which are the middle string players. Double up on the cellos as well. So now we've got essentially the same number of players we would in the regular orchestra, except they're all the really big low strings. By natural extension, anything I write for that ensemble is going to have a very unique sound because I don't know of anyone that's used that kind of ensemble before. So that's why I said it's cheating in a way. It automatically sounds different. Same thing with brass. No brass whatsoever. Even though they did want some heroic moments and they wanted to be able to have a wide range of emotions, the big heroic French horns and the kind of action, aggressive trombones and what people might consider, oh, a monster, get the brass to do this. Brrr. No brass at all. And then no woodwinds other than the really, really low woodwinds. And we used, 3 contrabass bassoons, of which normally there might be one in the orchestra. Maybe we had 3. 3 contrabass clarinets. Normally there might be one. Usually there aren't any at all. 3 with this low extension, and all of those instruments had the same lowest note. They all bottomed out in the same area. So a lot of the music that I wrote were in those keys where at some point in time during the music, they'd all hit that low note and everything would just kind of drop down. And it was really, it's almost hard to describe, but it's something that after 5 minutes of listening to it, you get used to it. And then you listen to something else. It's, wow, this sounds so light and airy and bright. It's almost a veiled quality to the order because of all the instruments. We also had male choir. That was the same idea of baritones, basses, and contrabasses. And these guys could sing as low as the lowest strings, which the choir literally sang an octave lower than I even expected. We showed up and they were singing what was written, and I looked over at the Sony guys and I said, it sounds fine, but it sounds too pretty. I mean, it sounds almost happy, even though it's not happy music. And we just said, we could drop it an octave. And they dropped the whole thing an octave down, and that was the sound. So that's what we did for the rest of the game. All low strings, all low woodwinds, and low choir. I started out as a drummer and as a percussionist. And I also played keyboard and guitar. But it's always been this. It's been with my hands. And about 3.5 years ago, I moved into a new studio, which I took 4 years to build. But the idea was that I could record things in there. And I just kind of naturally started tapping on things and banging on them. And then Tomb Raider came along, which seemed like the perfect excuse to dust off all my old drums and percussion and sticks and everything and play everything as live as possible. There was an aspect of the score with the Scavengers, was their name in the game, that we all agreed we needed something non-traditional and we wanted it to have some edge to it. So one of my favorite things was my first completely, I have no idea how this is going to turn out experiment, which is how most of them always start. And I've got chickens in my backyard. And there was a spare bit of chicken fence that was all rolled up the way it is bundled at the hardware store. And I was just hitting it with a stick, and it sounded pretty interesting, so I brought it into the studio, but it didn't have any resonance to it. So I went back out and took the top off the metal garbage can from the chicken hay feed thing, and I set that down, and almost like a pylon sort of building structure, and tapped that, and then it had this almost guitar spring reverb sound to it. And then I got my violin bow from my wife's 3/4 size practice violin that she used to play, because it was the only bow I had, and I bowed it. And that was the moment of, I've never heard this sound before. This is really, really interesting. And I literally pulled out my iPhone after I bowed it the first time and hit record with the movie and just did an up and down and bowed it once and immediately emailed it to the Tomb Raider audio guys. And they responded the same way I did. Oh my gosh, that's absolutely incredible. You're going to be putting that in the score, right? So that was the beginning of what became a journey of experimental kind of found sound percussion items that ended up culminating in the sculpture that was built. I think inherently I've always been fighting working in the box, is how we talk about it as composers. With technology today, it's absolutely fantastic because you have an entire symphony orchestra at your fingertips. The downside is everyone else has that exact same symphony orchestra at their fingertips, and as advanced as technology is, it's still not the same as live players. And I grew up with live players. I am a player, so I try to get as much live in there as possible. And something like Tomb Raider, we actually sacrificed the live budget because we wanted more music in the game. And I took it upon myself to be the live players. So the sculpture, the instrument as it ended up being called, was the culmination of about 18 months of working with someone I already knew, a friend of mine around the corner. Literally around the corner, 5 houses down, is his workshop in downtown Raleigh, and he's a metalsmith and a sculptor and does welding and everything, and he's a genius, Matt McConnell. So he and I spent about 1.5 years just coming up with little ideas. Let's do something with glass, let's do something with metal, let's do something with wood, let's do something with maybe some rods. And I would take it back to the studio and use it in the game and record it. And then eventually he put it all together in this sculpture, which is what he does for a living. He builds sculptures for commercial kinds of sites, restaurants and parks and things like that. And he hadn't really done anything like this because he had no input whatsoever from me. I just cared what it sounded like. And he was able to do whatever he wanted. And he played the game and looked at all the artwork. And the sculpture is basically his version of the island that everybody is on in Tomb Raider. And you can see a lot of that design. Even the bow, he made a little bow that you use to bow the metal on the sculpture, but it looks exactly like the bow that Lara makes at the beginning of the game, her makeshift bow. That's the kind of stuff. I love working with people like that because you end up with something so much greater and more interesting and different than it would have been if it were me wandering around the backyard trying to find something else besides the chicken wire to play. There's only so much that I can do on my own. Evolve was interesting because it was a two-pronged approach of trying something new and not really knowing how it was going to work out. I've honestly found the more I try something new and don't know how it's going to turn out, the happier I end up being in the long run. I just wish I could go back in time after a year and say, it's okay, year earlier, Jason, it's going to work out all right. Because you get kind of worked up about it and like, is this going to work? I'm not sure. I don't know how it's going to sound in the game. Because with games, you're basically writing the music and it's getting implemented as you go. And there's no redo, really. Especially something like Evolve, very electronic, and all of the organic natural sounds that were recorded were all in my studio. So at the end of the day, what I delivered got put in the game. And there wasn't a lot of time to fix things. So the idea was groove. That's our bed. If the music's going to come in, if you have a certain mission to do something, to maybe rescue some citizens, or if you're the monster, you're attacking a base, you'd have something that would come in that would acknowledge that you're moving forward and you're trying to do something. And then on top of that piece that was very low level kind of energy, throbbing, not getting in the way of any of the sound effects or anything like that, stingers, 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 stingers. And some would be 5 seconds long if maybe you see the trees rustle and some birds fly by. The monster might be over there. That would be a short stinger. Maybe a bigger event would happen. A monster would jump out and you would start a firefight. That would be a stinger that's maybe 20 seconds long. And it just slowly fades out. But the idea is they're all one-shots, and they're going on while this other bed is playing. So you're literally creating a new soundtrack as you progress through the game. Even if you're in that same state of gameplay for 10 minutes, every state would have, I don't know, 5 different kinds of stingers, and each type would have 5 or 6 variations. So you were pretty much guaranteed, no matter what happened, you're constantly being fed new music. And it's evolving as you're playing the game. It was a theory that we tried, and it seemed to work pretty well in the preliminary state. And then after that, it was kind of head down and had to get everything finished. I think there's a big catch-22 with working in LA, trying to get in the business, especially with film and TV, because you've got the totem pole that everybody has to climb. And I was in LA fresh out of school, so I was at the bottom of the totem pole. And you can only have so much creative flexibility if no one really knows who you are, what you do, what your music sounds like, and have any music to play for them. So of course, I'm going to be kind of boxed in and asked to copy something else. This is the idea of what we want. And if you get too far away, then you don't get the job. It was just creatively frustrating for me. That's why I love games. Even from the beginning, games have always seemed to embrace creativity and originality. Even if it's a big title and there's a lot depending on this game, they still want to be as original as possible. So I've made a conscious effort to work in games as much as I can. And the film that I've been doing, I've done a couple of feature films the last year and a half or so. Those have naturally evolved with relationships with people that I've known for a long time. They've just been kind of doing the same thing I have, and they're to the point now they're going to make a film. So I did commercials with them, I did ad work with them, I did corporate music with them. Now I'm doing films with them. Now I'm able to take the kind of creative license in film that I've been doing in games for the past 10 or 12 years because I have a relationship with the people that are working on the film. And it's just as much fun. It's just a different way of thinking about how the music gets put together. Sure. And in a lot of ways, there's an emotional line that you can connect with and really narrate musically a lot easier in the film because it's linear. Whereas the game, who knows what's going to happen when. So I think the challenge with film then is to be as guidance-oriented, but still stay out of the way. Because with games, let's face it, games are action-motivated. You're doing something in the game all the time, and the dialogue, when it comes, is important, but it's not there most of the time. It's usually the player with actions, which is why it's so much fun to write the music, because you can really take the front stage and call a lot of attention to the music and have it kind of flex its muscles a little bit. In film and TV, there are moments like that, but it's almost the opposite. It's dialogue driven. And when there's action going on, you can have it, but most of the time the dialogue is there and you got to be able to get out of the way of the dialogue. So they complement each other, kind of like different styles of music do. Between film and games, it's almost the best of both worlds. Soundtrack releases for games are especially tricky. It's essentially a balancing act because there's a lot more music written than you're going to be able to squeeze onto the soundtrack. I mean, I'll write 3 hours of music that potentially could be 9 or 10 hours in the game, and that's not looping it. That's an interactive evolution, the way the score works. I've got to condense that down to 60 minutes. So really, it's a matter of almost picking your favorite children, which is practically impossible. But it's more about, for me, when I'm given license to put together a soundtrack album, the best musical representation of the game in 60 minutes. So pick and choose the highlights and put it in chronological order because I'm a film music fan and it always irks me when the score is all turned around. I want to relive the experience through the music. And that makes it easier to pick and choose and kind of decide, well, that's an important moment. We kind of already highlighted that here. So that makes it easier for the soundtrack album itself. And by extension, it makes it easier when I'm doing suites for live performance. A lot of times that's exactly what I'll do. I'll do a suite of music. And that enables the concert venue to determine which pieces out of this 15-minute suite they want to feature without having to maybe play the whole thing because they've only got an hour. Or they can play the whole thing and it works as a story still. It's still an even smaller version of what the soundtrack album was. Okay. My favorite thing about writing music for games, which was completely unexpected, is the fans. I had no idea how voraciously excited they get about a new game, a new release, any little tidbits of information they can get. It makes sense once I thought about it because they're playing this game for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. And the music, it's just like listening to music from film or TV. You're reliving the experience, listening to it. There's concerts all over the world now that are only video game music. And I've had the pleasure of attending many of them, either in Los Angeles or in Sweden. I've had music performed in Germany or in London. And I'm always pleasantly surprised at the turnout and the appreciation that's there. Because the music's completely divorced from the medium now. We're just sitting at a concert hall where who knows what classical music was performed the night before. You've got an orchestra and some drums and some other extra instruments, and it's just there to appreciate the music for what it is, which is really the greatest compliment for me because you're actively listening, and that's it. You're just listening to the music, and of course, that's the whole reason I'm here in the first place, is to write music that connects with people and that they want to listen to.